America is the direct product of thousands upon thousands of years of human development, and it serves today as a symbol of national unity to the entire world. But every symbol or emblem needs to be forged in the mold before it can glitter like the stars. America is no different. Today, fellow civilization that had the fortune of happening upon this time capsule, I hope to convey to you how we got our little colonist civilization to become one of the greatest nations in the world. And I hope for you just as equally to appreciate its history. My name is Richard Hadman, and this is the KEPLAR Project.
You know, it's funny. When checks and balances were implemented, it was done so that with the thought, okay, there is no way that any one branch can reach its power without ruffling the feathers of the other two branches. However, it just wasn't the case. With how the Constitution was written, judicial review was implied but never truly stated. And it isn't until we see Marbury v. Madison and its conclusion that we see it being exercised.
Even before the whole ratification of the Constitution, there was wild debate about the constitutionality of judicial review. On one side, you had major figures such as Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists expressing their views in favor of it in Federalist papers, and on the other side were anti-Federalist papers such as Brutus with an opposing perspective against it. The debate would flare on as before the formal institution of judicial review, Congress would be free to pass laws that would not have to be checked by any other branch of government. Meanwhile, in and around this time, Jefferson was getting transitioned into office and Adams was on his way out. In an effort to maintain Federalist control of legislation, Adams would appoint 16 judges right at the end of his presidency, who would hence be called the Midnight Judges. One of these, William Marbury, was denied his appointment as Adams had yet to give him his commission before his term ended. Jefferson would instead ask the Secretary of State, James Madison, to withhold the commission. In retaliation to the decision, Marbury would go on to plead his case to the court, thus conceiving the court case Marbury v. Madison, with the penultimate decision being at the discretion of Chief Justice John Marshall.
So Chief Justice John Marshall is now in an awkward position. He has to settle a dispute between two federal officers, or rather individuals, whereas the Supreme Court had beforehand always settled state-by-state disputes. In a similarly awkward manner, if Marshall approved Marbury, Jefferson was in a position to simply deny it with the power vested in the executive branch. Likewise, if Marshall denied Marbury, it would further cement the power of the executive and legislative branches above the judiciary. So, Marshall came up with one of the most ingenious things possible given the situation. He both handled the situation presented while also strengthening the role of the judiciary branch.
Marshall would turn to Article 3 of the Constitution and dissect it in order to make the appropriate decision while not forfeiting the existing powers of the judiciary branch. With all the pieces in place, the decision could be made. Judiciary review of laws and decisions to the behest of the other two branches of government was instituted, and Marbury was respectfully declined his position in a 4-0 vote.
Liberty Bell, oh boy, it would serve as a symbol for a number of movements. It's so iconic. Right next to the Statue of Liberty, it probably is one of the most iconic American artifacts in all of history.
Liberty Bell is one of the most significant American artifacts all of history. It would be purchased from England at around €100 at the time, and done so to hang in Pennsylvania's new State House in honor of the 50-year anniversary of William Penn's Charter of the Privileges. The distinctive features of Liberty Bell include the large crack which runs on its front side along with the quote accompanying the crack. Proclaim liberty through all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Abolitionists would give it its name, most prominently William Lloyd Garrison, who would refer to it as such in his poem The Liberty Bell and the Liberator. Many other organizations, such as the New York Anti-Slave Society, would also use it as a symbol of liberty. Liberty Bell, along with the American flag, would be used as a symbol of national healing. It would literally travel around the country to proclaim liberty throughout all the land, and a replica of it would be used for a similar purpose during the women's suffrage movement.
Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, all the inhabitants thereof. If that isn't the most American thing ever written with, exception to the Constitution, because that is like the America, right? Like, that's so pure-blooded American. It just makes my heart warm. No, yeah, very little embodies the true, like, honest-to-God spirit of America, quite like that quote in that engraving. And that's going to serve as a motive for a number of people to appreciate and acknowledge Liberty Bell as a symbol of, liberty. And quite ironically, the crack in the middle. It's going to serve to symbolize the divide of the notion of liberty for many decades and centuries. Post-Civil War, you have people that are thinking liberty is this one, or pre-Civil War, you have people thinking liberty is one thing, while it could be this other thing, and people aren't like embodying true liberty, but we get there eventually, and that quote, so powerful. I think that if not for unifying artifacts such as the Liberty Bell or the Statue of Liberty, or literally anything else, we as Americans would have so much more of a struggle with national identity. National identity would be so much bigger of a struggle. And I think that's where the importance of Liberty Bell comes in. It's not as some quote or a metaphor for national divide, but rather as a symbol of union and liberty between all American people.
The art piece depicted here displays American lawyer Francis Scott Key overlooking the destruction of his homeland at the hands of the British. This would serve as his inspiration to work on and compile our nation's anthem today, the Star-Spangled Banner. Key was sent on behalf of James Madison to recover Dr. William Beanes, who was being held under British control after attempting to confront him about the plundering of his property during the War of 1812. Key, particularly annoyed that he would be negotiating with the people that had invaded the Chesapeake region, as well as attacked the nation's capital not moments before, boarded the Tonnant reluctantly in order to dispute Beanes' capture. Aboard the ship, however, Key would witness the assault on Baltimore, and so deeply affected by the sheer violence exercised in the city, go on to construct our nation's national anthem. While we would not see it recognized as such until nearly a century after its conception, it does embody the spirit of America, the defense of the homeland exercised by those that cherish it, and show us that we are all united under one Star-Spangled Banner.
There are few people in American history with as accomplished of a career as John Marshall. His resume, it ranges from patriot to politician to jurist. It's all over the place. And it's so easy to point to accomplished figures like George Washington or Abe Lincoln or Hamilton as pillars of America and American history. But we really owe it to people like Marshall, who ran the gargantuan stage play of America from the background, behind the scenes.
John Marshall, born September 24, 1755, near a local Virginia establishment, Germantown, is beyond a shadow of a doubt one of the most influential American figures. His first major involvement in American heroics would be as a Minuteman in 1775 alongside his father. This role would eventually lead him to work as a lieutenant under George Washington himself in the American Revolution. He would then rise to the rank of captain, and after the war's conclusion, he would turn his eyes toward politics and serve on Virginia's Executive Council from 82 to 85.
A bit of irony with Marshall's involvement in politics is that, as difficult as it is to believe, he was never formally trained. He had some brief exposure and experience through his education, but it was never really anything truly in depth, like other American drafters of the Constitution or politicians. The other interesting thing about this is it adds on to the trend of military heroes like George Washington that were elected for office being surprisingly adept at the role. It's a very interesting trend that is really only observable in America. He was a surprisingly apprehensive individual. He would time and time again be offered a position in government. For the majority of the times, though, he's going to just decline them. U.S. Attorney for West Virginia, decline. Secretary of War under Adams, declined. And this is just going to be a pattern that goes on and on. Until we see Chief Justice Ellsworth resigning from the position, and John Jay, the next fill-in, would respectfully decline. And so Marshall is going to be offered this position, and for whatever reason, Marshall is going to accept it. And with that, we have Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court. It's quite the interesting development in him as a person.
Marshall would accept the position of Chief Justice of the United States and would serve for 34 years, the longest run of any Chief Justice in American history. Marshall would also serve to be one of the most influential Chief Justices, being behind the decisions of multiple landmark cases: Marbury v. Madison and the establishment of the Judiciary Review, Martin v. Hunter Less, Cohen v. Virginia affirming the court's ability to overrule a state court on a federal decision, and McCulloch v. Maryland asserting implied powers given in the Constitution. These are only a few of the hundreds of cases Marshall will accept, and in each, Marshall will exemplify the duty of the Supreme Court and the American citizen to uphold the law.
America is going to be confined to the East for a very, very long time. The reason being, they didn't have the authority to the land. It belonged to the French, British, Native Americans. It belonged to a whole variety of people. But that's up until the Louisiana Purchase is made. The Louisiana Purchase is going to allow Americans to start flooding into the West, and it's going to create a ton of new opportunities, a couple of which I will describe promptly. The first major development that's going to come from westward expansion is going to be Manifest Destiny. Now, Manifest Destiny is going to be a big motivator for a lot of American citizens to move out to the West, away from the East. That Manifest Destiny being this strong moral belief that they have the right and the obligation to colonize and civilize all of the Western world that is going to be pretty wild and rugged before they put American feet on it. Another enticing factor of the West is the sheer degree of opportunities that it provides. One such being the gold rush, where California, gold was relatively common and it is insanely profitable. So a lot of people would drop everything they had and move out to California, many of whom are not going to observe a profit being made. Other things, or other people that are going to find a degree of opportunity, a ton of opportunity in the West, are corporations, especially with the integration of the Transcontinental Railroad now being present all throughout the West. They're going to see oil-rich or just resource-rich areas in general, and they're going to want to capitalize on that and plant their feet there. Another major act that people are going to be motivated to move west by is the Homestead Act of 1862. There's a ton of new land that the government just has legal ownership of, but they don't know what to do with it because they can't get corporations on there because they're already in their own little territory. So what they're going to do is they're going to incentivize citizens to move on to them through the Homestead Act. And what the Homestead Act did is it gave 160 acres of land to any U.S. citizen that applied for it. And if the U.S. citizen maintained and kept that land for 5 years, that pit of land would then be theirs. It would be under their ownership. And this act alone is going to catalyze tons of people moving out west. And that in combination with Manifest Destiny and Opportunity should more than prove that westward expansion was such a pivotal moment in American history that is never likely going to be seen again just because of the degree of change that it brought to the entire nation. With that concludes the KEPLAR Project. Whichever civilization manages to happen upon this, I hope this serves as a bit of faith in the greater universe out there. How it's not just you that has an extensive history, it's everywhere. And America is just one microcosm of a great, vast galaxy out there, and even just a small part of even our world. I hope that you manage to take something away from this, maybe even an appreciation for foreign life forms. And at the very least, I hope that you come to acknowledge a little bit of the history of America and the glory that we, as Americans, express and the pride that we have in our country and its history.